They slid the check across the desk like it was garbage. Just $500. That's what they thought his silence was worth. The lead attorney smirked, cocky in his $3,000 suit, and said, "Take it or leave it, old man." He didn't blink, didn't touch the check. Instead, he reached slowly into his worn leather jacket, the kind that tells stories without saying a word, and pulled out a weathered manila envelope. The lawyers didn't know it yet, but they'd just made the worst mistake of their careers. Because inside that envelope were the documents they'd spent decades trying to bury. He wasn't just a forgotten veteran. He was the rightful heir to stolen land, land worth hundreds of millions. And he had the proof they'd sworn would never surface. Welcome to the Veteran Voices. Before we dive into this incredible tale of justice delayed but not denied, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We're growing every day because of viewers like you who understand that truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep it's buried. The law offices of Morrison, Blackwell and Associates occupied 3 floors of a gleaming downtown tower that cast shadows over the older buildings below. On the 42nd floor, behind bulletproof glass and marble walls, the firm's senior partners conducted business with the kind of quiet efficiency that came from decades of making problems disappear. They specialized in corporate defense, environmental cleanup, and what they diplomatically called legacy issues, the messy complications that arose when modern development collided with inconvenient history. That Tuesday morning in November, Thomas Morrison himself sat at the head of a conference table that cost more than most people's cars. At 63, he had silver hair perfectly styled and a reputation for ruthlessness that stretched from Wall Street to Washington. Beside him sat Rebecca Blackwell, his longtime partner, a woman whose smile never reached her eyes and whose closing arguments had buried more lawsuits than anyone cared to count. They were flanked by junior associates clutching thick files and tablets loaded with research, all waiting for what should have been the easiest settlement meeting of their careers. The case file was thin, almost laughably so. An elderly veteran named William Cross had filed a claim against Meridian Development Corporation, alleging that his family's land had been illegally seized in the 1950s to build what was now downtown's most valuable commercial district. The towers, shopping centers, and office complexes that generated hundreds of millions in annual revenue supposedly sat on property that had belonged to the Cross family for generations. It was the kind of claim that surfaced occasionally in major cities. Distant relatives emerging from obscurity with faded documents and family stories, hoping to strike it rich by challenging development that had happened decades ago. Morrison had handled dozens of similar cases, usually settling for nuisance amounts just to make them go away. The statute of limitations had long expired, the original owners were dead, and the paper trail had been lost to time and bureaucracy. This case seemed even weaker than most. William Cross was 74 years old, a former Army mechanic who lived alone in a small apartment across town. He had no lawyer, having been turned away by every firm he'd contacted. His initial filing was handwritten on forms he'd downloaded from the internet, full of dates and references that seemed more like family folklore than legal evidence. The court had only allowed the case to proceed because Cross had filed as an indigent plaintiff, and even then, it was scheduled for summary dismissal. Morrison had assigned the case to a junior associate who'd recommended offering Cross a small settlement, maybe $5,000, just to close the file. But something about the old man's persistence had irritated Morrison. Cross had called the office repeatedly, insisting he had evidence that would change everything. He'd shown up at the building twice, trying to speak with someone in person. Security had escorted him out both times, but he'd remained polite, almost apologetic, saying he just wanted someone to look at his documents. "Let's make this quick," Morrison said as they waited. "We offer him $500, maybe $1,000 if he pushes back. He'll take it. They always do." Blackwell nodded, reviewing her notes. The property in question covers 8 city blocks in the commercial district. Current assessed value is approximately $200 million, but with development rights and future projections, we're looking at closer to $500 million. If by some miracle he had a legitimate claim, which he doesn't, it would be the largest property dispute in the city's history. One of the junior associates looked up from his tablet. "Should we be concerned about the media attention? I mean, if word gets out that we're dealing with a veteran's land claim." Morrison waved dismissively. There won't be any media attention because there won't be a case. We settle today for pocket change. He signs a non-disclosure agreement, and we never hear from him again. Meridian has been developing that district for decades without any problems. They have clean title to everything. The conference room door opened, and Morrison's secretary led in a man who looked nothing like what they'd expected. William Cross was tall and lean, with silver hair combed neatly back and clothes that were clean but clearly not expensive. His leather jacket was worn smooth at the elbows, his boots were polished but old, and he carried himself with the straight-backed posture of someone who'd spent years in uniform. His eyes were sharp and alert, scanning the room with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to notice details. "Mr. Cross," Morrison said without standing. "Please, have a seat. I'm Thomas Morrison, and this is Rebecca Blackwell. We represent Meridian Development Corporation." Cross nodded politely and sat across from them, placing his hands flat on the table. He didn't seem intimidated by the expensive surroundings or the array of lawyers facing him. If anything, he appeared calm, almost patient, like a man who'd been preparing for this moment for a very long time. "We've reviewed your claim," Blackwell began, her tone professional but dismissive. "And while we appreciate your family's concerns about the property development in the downtown district, I'm afraid your case lacks the substantive evidence required for litigation." Cross listened without interrupting, his expression neutral. Morrison leaned forward, deciding to cut to the chase. "Here's what we're prepared to offer, Mr. Cross. $500 and a mutual agreement that this matter is closed permanently. It's a generous settlement considering the weakness of your position." For a moment, Cross said nothing. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope, placing it carefully on the table between them. The envelope was yellowed with age, its edges soft with handling, and it was secured with string rather than a metal clasp. "Before you make any decisions," Cross said quietly, "I think you should see what I've brought." Morrison exchanged a glance with Blackwell. They'd seen this before: family photographs, old letters, maybe a deed copy that proved nothing. But something about Cross's demeanor gave him pause. The old man wasn't desperate or angry. He wasn't pleading or threatening. He was simply certain. Cross untied the string and opened the envelope with careful hands. The first document he withdrew was a surveyor's map, hand-drawn on heavy paper that had been folded and unfolded countless times. The ink had faded to brown, but the lines and measurements were still clear. Across the top, in flowing script, were the words Cross Family Holdings, Section 12, Township 3 North. Morrison reached for the map, his confidence beginning to waver. The survey showed property boundaries that encompassed exactly the area now occupied by Meridian's most valuable developments. In the corner was a stamp and signature he recognized from his research into the city's early land records. "This is a copy," Blackwell said quickly, though her voice had lost some of its certainty. Cross nodded and withdrew the second document. This one made the room go silent. It was an original land patent, signed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1943, granting 640 acres to Samuel Cross in recognition of faithful service and in accordance with the Homestead Extension Act. The presidential seal was embossed in gold, and Roosevelt's signature was unmistakably authentic. "My grandfather," Cross said simply. "He served in the First World War, came home, and applied for homestead land. The government granted him this property because it was considered too swampy and remote for commercial development. He spent 30 years turning it into farmland." Morrison's hands shook slightly as he examined the patent. This wasn't a copy or a reproduction. This was an original federal document, complete with serial numbers and registry stamps that could be verified. If authentic, it would establish clear title to the property dating back to the 1940s. But Cross wasn't finished. The third document was a deed transfer, dated 1952, signed by Samuel Cross and his son Robert, William's father. It showed the property being passed to the next generation, complete with updated surveys that matched the original patent exactly. The notary stamps were clear, the signatures were witnessed, and the document had been properly recorded with the county. In 1954, Cross continued, his voice steady. "Representatives from something called the Municipal Development Authority came to see my father. They said the city needed the land for a highway project, that it was being taken under eminent domain. They offered him $12,000 for property that was worth at least $50,000 even then. He withdrew a fourth document, a letter on official city letterhead, signed by the mayor and the city attorney, confirming the eminent domain proceedings and the compensation offer. My father refused, Cross said. He'd put 20 years of his life into that land. So they came back with a different approach. The next document made Blackwell actually gasp. It was a court order, dated 1955, declaring Samuel Cross mentally incompetent and appointing the Municipal Development Authority as conservator of his property. The order was signed by Judge Harrison Meridian, the same family name as the development company now occupying the land. They had my grandfather declared incompetent, Cross explained, his voice carrying decades of suppressed anger. A man who'd built a successful farm, raised a family, served his country. Suddenly, he was too mentally deficient to manage his own affairs. The conservator sold the property to the city for the original $12,000 offer, and somehow it ended up in the hands of a private development company within 6 months. Morrison felt sweat forming on his forehead. The implications were staggering. If these documents were authentic, they showed a pattern of fraud and conspiracy that stretched back 70 years. The land had been stolen through false legal proceedings, and the theft had been covered up by officials who later profited from the development. But Cross still wasn't done. He withdrew a series of photographs, black and white images that showed the property as it had existed in the 1940s and early 1950s. There was the Cross family farmhouse, a substantial 2-story structure with a wraparound porch. There were barns and outbuildings, fields of crops, and livestock. In several photos, family members stood proudly beside their home, including a tall man in overalls who bore a strong resemblance to William Cross. These were taken by a photographer from the County Agricultural Extension Office, Cross said. They were documenting successful homestead farms for a government report. The photographer gave copies to my grandfather. The final documents were the most damaging of all. Cross withdrew a manila folder containing correspondence between Judge Meridian, the mayor, and officials from what would later become Meridian Development Corporation. The letters discussed plans to acquire strategic properties for development, with specific mention of the Cross farm as prime commercial real estate that can be obtained through administrative means. One letter, dated just weeks before the competency hearing, included the phrase that would later appear in newspaper headlines: "The old man will never know what hit him." The conference room was dead silent. Morrison stared at the documents spread across the table, his legal mind racing through the implications. This wasn't just a property dispute. It was evidence of a massive fraud that had generated hundreds of millions of dollars in illegal profits. And sitting across from him was the rightful heir to property that was now worth more than most small cities. Blackwell was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. Where have these been all this time?" Cross carefully gathered the documents back into their envelope. "My father kept them hidden for 50 years. He knew what had happened, but he also knew he didn't have the resources to fight the people who'd stolen from us. He worked as a janitor for 30 years, saved every penny he could, and waited. When he died, he left me these documents and a letter explaining everything." He reached into his jacket again and withdrew one final piece of paper, a handwritten note in faded ink. "This is what my father wrote to me," Cross said, unfolding the letter. "Son, they took everything from us, but they couldn't take the truth. Someday, when you're strong enough and they're not expecting it, show them these papers. Make them remember that stealing from honest people has consequences, even if those consequences take 70 years to arrive." Morrison realized his mouth was hanging open. He closed it and tried to regain his composure, but the numbers were spinning through his head like a slot machine. $200 million in current property value, decades of rental income and development profits, punitive damages for fraud and conspiracy, interest compounded over 70 years. They were looking at potentially the largest property settlement in American legal history, and they'd just offered the rightful owner $500 to go away quietly. Blackwell cleared her throat, her professional mask slipping completely. "Mr. Cross, these documents, if they're authentic, this changes everything." Cross nodded calmly. "I know." Morrison leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. "You understand what this means? If these hold up in court, you're not just talking about the property. There's 70 years of lost income, development profits, Punitive damages for fraud. I understand, Cross said simply. I also understand that your client has been profiting from stolen property for 7 decades. The junior associates were frantically typing on their tablets, probably running preliminary calculations on damages. One of them looked up with wide eyes and shook his head at Morrison, who understood the gesture perfectly. The numbers were astronomical. Blackwell gathered herself and shifted into damage control mode. Of course, we'd need to authenticate these documents. Have them examined by experts. Verify the signatures. Cross reached into his jacket one more time and withdrew a business card. I've already had them authenticated by the National Archives, the Roosevelt Presidential Library, and 3 independent document experts. Their reports are available whenever you're ready to see them. Morrison felt his career flashing before his eyes. This wasn't just a legal disaster. It was a historical scandal that would make national headlines. A veteran's family robbed of their land through corrupt legal proceedings, with a trail of evidence leading directly to one of the city's most prominent development companies. Mr. Cross, Morrison said carefully, what exactly are you looking for here? Cross smiled for the first time since entering the room. It wasn't a cruel smile, but it wasn't entirely gentle either. It was the smile of a man who'd waited his entire life for this moment and was savoring every second of it. Justice, he said simply. For my grandfather, who died believing he'd failed his family. For my father, who spent 50 years carrying the weight of what had been stolen from us. And for every other family who's been bulldozed by people with more money than conscience. He stood up, tucking the envelope back into his jacket. I'll be filing an amended complaint tomorrow morning. My new attorney. And yes, I found one willing to take the case once they saw these documents. We'll be in touch with your office to discuss settlement negotiations. Morrison's voice cracked slightly. What kind of settlement are we talking about? Cross paused at the door and looked back at the lawyers who'd just learned they were on the wrong side of history. Well, he said, you offered me $500 to go away quietly. I think I'll start my negotiations at $500 million and see where we end up. The door closed behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo like thunder in the silent conference room. 3 months later, the settlement negotiations concluded in the same conference room where William Cross had been offered $500 to disappear. This time, the room was packed with lawyers from both sides, representatives from Meridian Development Corporation, city officials, and members of the media who had turned the case into a national story about corporate greed and delayed justice. The final settlement amount was sealed by court order, but informed estimates placed it at over $300 million, one of the largest property fraud settlements in American history. Meridian Development Corporation was forced to restructure completely, with new management and oversight boards designed to prevent similar abuses. But the most significant moment came not when the settlement was signed, but when William Cross walked out of the building for the final time. Waiting for him on the sidewalk was a small group of veterans from his old Army unit, men who'd driven from across the country to witness their friend's vindication. They didn't say much. Soldiers rarely do when words seem inadequate. But their presence spoke volumes about the bonds forged in service and the respect earned through decades of quiet dignity. Cross used part of his settlement to establish a legal aid foundation specializing in property rights cases for veterans and their families. He also purchased a small farm outside the city, where he built a modest house with a wraparound porch that looked remarkably similar to the one his grandfather had built 70 years earlier. The property that had been stolen from his family was eventually developed into a memorial park, with a bronze plaque honoring Samuel Cross and other homestead families who'd helped build the city. It wasn't the justice that could bring back the decades of struggle and uncertainty, but it was recognition that truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep it's buried or how long it takes. In the end, the lawyers who'd sneered at an old man with a worn jacket and a manila envelope learned something that veterans have always known. Never underestimate the power of someone who's been preparing for battle their entire life. And never, ever, assume that silence means surrender. Sometimes justice takes 70 years to arrive, but when it does, it comes with interest compounded and a reckoning that no amount of money or influence can avoid. William Cross understood this from the moment he walked into that conference room, carrying the truth in a weathered envelope and the patience of a man who'd learned that the right moment is worth waiting for. The corporate lawyers thought they were dealing with just another desperate claimant, hoping for a quick payout. Instead, they found themselves face to face with the heir to a legacy of theft that had finally come home to roost. And in the space between their arrogant offer and his quiet revelation, a wrong that had festered for generations was finally made right. This story was brought to you by the Veteran Voices. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Someone who carried the weight of injustice quietly, waiting for the right moment to seek the truth they'd always known was theirs. Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how their patience and dignity inspired you to keep fighting for what's right. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.